Marijuana. It's the most popular illicit drug in America and a multi-billion-dollar industry.
These cartels will stop at nothing in furtherance of the almighty dollar.
And you'll never guess where they're growing it.
I don't think a lot of the public realizes that these people are here.
There's a lot of heat coming right out of there.
Could it be in your neighborhood?
Would people be surprised to know that their next-door neighbor could be a grower?
Not anymore.
Plus,
medical marijuana recommendations.
Some call it a wonder drug.
It was the only thing that alleviated any of my symptoms.
A battle brewing in California.
It is the Wild West right now.
Why'd they do this to our clubs?
This man could face the rest of his life in prison.
What happened to Charles Lynch is wrong.
I'll lose everything if they take me to jail that day.
Why some say our marijuana laws aren't working.
The prohibition of marijuana is much more harmful to the user and to society than the actual use of marijuana.
Marijuana. 100 million Americans have tried it, and yet it remains one of the most controversial drugs. Effectively outlawed in 1937, it's become a multi-billion-dollar industry with a steady demand and no shortage of supply. In fact, sometimes you needn't look any further than the house next door to find it growing. "7:30 in the morning, Miami, Florida.
Go up, do a consent.
Agents of the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, and police gather in a parking lot to get briefed on the day's mission.
We're going to go to 128.
The plan? To hit a list of homes they suspect are marijuana grow houses.
The registered owner doesn't live at this address, but that's where they delivered it to.
They have no idea what or whom they'll find.
Anybody got any questions? Get your guns.
Every scenario we approach with the same amount of safety because we don't know who's on the other side of the door.
While much of the city is still waking up, the agents drive 10 cars deep onto quiet suburban streets where they say secret grow houses blend in with the house next door.
This is a nice neighborhood. Nice-looking homes, decent backyards. Would people be surprised to know that there are growers? Their next-door neighbor could be a grower?
Not anymore. This used to be uncommon years ago, but now it's quite common.
Tony Angeli says grow houses, while not a new phenomenon, are increasing in size and scope. And the typical indoor grow they see, about 100 to 150 plants, is a multi-million-dollar operation. Each plant yields about a pound of marijuana, worth at least $3,500 on the Miami streets, and can be harvested 3 to 4 times a year.
Florida, unfortunately, is the nation's capital for grow houses. On the books right now this year, we have over 700 grows, and we're looking at 1,000 by the end of the year.
While marijuana generally has a reputation as a mild drug, its illegal cultivation, Angeli says, is serious business, oftentimes involving organized crime. Case in point, in 2006, South Florida police bust a huge marijuana growing operation in the unassuming suburb of Port St. Lucie, Florida, involving 59 houses in all.
What set this investigation apart from so many other grow houses that we encounter was the breadth, the level of organization, and the degree of sophistication.
The operation was masterminded and financed by a New Jersey business that recruited mostly Cuban immigrants with an irresistible sales pitch. Live in a new home, all expenses paid. Just one catch.
Under the relocation package, each homeowner agreed to maintain a grow house for a minimum of 2 years, after which the homeowner had the right to sell the house if he so wished and split the gains 50-50.
The grower also got a quarter share of the profits, some houses earning up to $5 million worth of pot a year. 35 suspects were brought in on federal drug charges, and those convicted faced as much as 20 to 40 years in prison.
Will you get calls sometimes from people in the neighborhood?
Yes, quite often. Neighbors will see different things around the neighborhood, become suspicious, and call our hotline.
But on this day, the DEA is working on tips from informants and other sources, doing what's known as knock-and talks. searches which require the owner's consent.
Is that a successful tactic? I mean, will people actually let you come into their house if they're growing stuff inside?
Quite often, yes.
Really?
You'd be surprised.
Why?
A lot of times people are cooperative with law enforcement, more so than any other reason. I believe that they think they know we're onto them. And they say, well, you've got me. Come on in.
Outside, if no one's home, the agents look for certain telltale signs. Spikes in electricity, extra air conditioning units, and homes that don't have that lived-in look. After a few minutes search, agents rule out this house.
It was clean. There was nothing there.
But towards the end of the day, the agents think they may have something.
Right now, we're just waiting on the canine to see if he can detect anything.
Find it.
The dog's trained to detect the smell of marijuana. He's the best tool we have to detect that.
DEA agent Jeanette Moran says she became suspicious during the search as the owner rushes them from room to room.
And I've never seen anybody go through a house that quickly, opening doors. Every door must have been closed, and I think we went from one end of the house to the other in about 3 seconds flat.
But once inside the bathroom, Moran's trained ears perk up.
We could hear blowers, except if you look in the bathroom, there's no blower attached. You can see all the drywall that's been probably torn down to help put the grow up there.
The giveaway? A ladder in a clothes closet with a tile in the ceiling carved out. Once they climb the ladder and move the ceiling tile, it leads to an attic that leads to another tiny room. In it, a marijuana grow, but not the size they're expecting.
This is a relatively small indoor grow, 11 plants, maybe about 10 inches to a foot tall. They're not seedling plants, they're a little bit more mature, but they're just getting started.
Angeli says even this small grow can yield a surprising amount of money.
These little plants are a little bit deceiving right now. These are 11 plants. Once they grow to maturity, they will yield, in less than 3 months, 11 pounds of marijuana, worth over $50,000.
There are those who would say, look, you're putting all this effort into this. Why don't you concentrate on the bigger drugs, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, prescription pills? Is this a good use of time and resources for the DEA?
This is an excellent use of DEA resources, and we're targeting everything. All the drugs you just mentioned, this issue is very important to us.
Most people would say, hey, look, it's marijuana. What's the big deal?
It's more potent now than ever. So the days of the former arguments about it being a mild drug that everybody uses, those days are over.
Angeli says controlled conditions and sophisticated growing techniques have made marijuana stronger and therefore more dangerous. The government considers it a gateway to more serious drugs and spends millions of dollars a year on marijuana law enforcement. Pro-marijuana groups argue that in the cases of more potent pot, users adjust their intake and smoke less. And they say there's no evidence that marijuana leads to harder drugs. As for the government's war on marijuana, they say it's expensive and has had little effect on the millions of users. A drug war raging in our national parks and forests.
I kept thinking if I turn my back, I'm going to get a bullet in the back of my head. My thought was, this is a stupid way to die in the middle of the Nevada desert over marijuana.
October 2008. 3 biologists were surveying streams and terrain in a remote part of northern Nevada.
Here's our footprints right here.
They walked 3 miles through a canyon when something amidst the gray and brown desert stood out.
There was a plant that just caught my attention. It was extremely green, 5 or 6 feet tall, and looked just out of place.
One of our coworkers said, "Is this what I think it is?" And we're like, "Yeah, it looks like marijuana. That's what it is."
The men, 2 of whom wished to remain unidentified, thought little of it. But a few feet further down, they saw another plant.
He said, "It looks like that was cut and placed there by somebody." Then I got kind of a knot in my stomach and thought, something's not right.
Suddenly, 2 armed men leapt up from behind sagebrush.
It was right here that the 2 men popped up a little to our left over here. They didn't say a word, which made me even more frightened. I could tell immediately that they were Hispanic. I dropped my walking stick, which is right here. We put our hands in the air, started saying no, 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 and started speaking Spanish and telling them who we were.
Seconds later, a third man named Tony emerged with a rifle. He spoke to them in English.
He continued to interrogate us, ask us who we were, why we were there. I kept thinking if I turn my back, I'm going to get a bullet in the back of my head.
After 10 minutes of tense negotiating, the growers let the biologist go.
Here's an example of the black seedling trays they brought the plants out in.
The next day, when law enforcement rode in, the growers were gone. They left behind everything: shoes, food, clothes, trash, and 800 marijuana plants worth an estimated $5 million. A relatively small grow compared to those seen in the thousands in California, Washington, and Oregon. While face-to-face encounters with illegal growers aren't common, the situation represents an alarming trend. Armed and dangerous DTOs, drug trafficking organizations, harvesting marijuana on public lands and remote areas of the country's national parks and forests.
It's a big problem, and it seems to be getting worse.
Mark Pirtle is a special agent in charge with the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada.
We hear all the news reports about, all the drug wars going on the border right now, the murders and shootings and everything. And I don't think a lot of the public realizes that these people are here.
In fact, the Office of National Drug Control Policy estimates 65% of the marijuana grown in the U.S. is grown on public lands, the vast majority by Mexican cartels. They grow here because it's gotten tougher to smuggle marijuana across the border.
Somebody came up with the idea that we'll smuggle in our people to grow the marijuana, and it cuts down a lot of logistics. So now they grow it and they sell it right here.
Usually, the men tending to the fields camp out next to the grow for 3 to 4 months at a time.
You can see they have coffee back here, sugar, a lot of supplies, all the staples. These individuals are staying out here for quite a long time.
In addition to food and supplies, they typically haul in miles of hoses to set up elaborate irrigation systems.
See the water pressure that you can build up on these things? Pretty impressive. So that's a pretty good example of how much water these guys are using out of the creek.
They use tarps to camouflage their activity.
This here was the main processing area. When we first got here, these tarps were it was almost like an enclosed structure, and maybe a 20 by 35-foot structure. Almost impossible to see from there, as you can see.
Once law enforcement spots the fields, the growers hear the helicopters and run. The occasional arrest rarely leads to the top guns.
Unfortunately, most of the time, those arrests are low-level garden workers that don't really know anything. They don't know who the big bosses are.
But Rafael Reyes knows all too well who those big bosses are.
The most ruthless, violent individuals and organizations in the world today. These cartels will do anything, will stop at nothing in furtherance of the almighty dollar.
Reyes says marijuana is the cartel's cash cow, cheap to grow and extremely profitable.
The true and tried method of making money has always been marijuana. It's what allows them to further their bases of operations into other drugs. For example, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. They're all fueled by the proceeds generated through marijuana.
And if Mexican cartels are our biggest foreign supplier, then the United States consumer is their #1 customer.
That casual consumer doesn't realize what he or she is contributing to. Indirectly, our guys in Mexico are fighting a war. Cops are being killed day in and day out. Police officers that are being kidnapped, tortured, and murdered to further intimidate and break the will of the people and of these brothers' officers.
These Mexican drug cartels, how much money are we talking about?
Conservatively, in the billions and billions of dollars.
Each year?
Each year.
If you're selling it out on the street, how much would this amount of marijuana bring?
In the Northeast region, that'll generate approximately about $100,000.
This one package?
That one package. And when you consider the fact that to produce that was just a couple of $100.
That's an amazing profit margin.
And the DEA says the cartels are extremely inventive when it comes to ways to keep those profits and reach their U.S. customers. Not only are they operating on public lands, but they're building elaborate tunnels that extend underneath the border for almost a half a mile.
From your basic hole in the ground to now highly sophisticated tunnels that have lighting systems in it, oxygen, have railroad tracks.
Whoa, railroad tracks?
Railroad tracks.
It's an endless cycle of drugs, money, and violence. One that a marijuana policy reform lobby says could be stopped in its tracks if marijuana were legalized, taxed, and regulated here, like alcohol.
Right now in California, you don't see drug cartels from Mexico setting up and growing grapes. They're not growing grapes to make wine to sell it because it's a regulated market. The profit margin's relatively low because it is regulated, and someone who wants to grow grapes can just get a license and do it.
The Marijuana Policy Project insists marijuana is much safer than alcohol and tobacco and should be treated in much the same way. Cartels, they say, would have little incentive to be here if there's no money to be made.
It makes perfect sense to end the marijuana prohibition that we've seen on the books since 1937. Yes, there will be problems with marijuana use. Yes, some people will abuse it. But the prohibition of marijuana is much more harmful to the user and to society than the actual use of marijuana.
And one added benefit, according to the Marijuana Policy Project, if prohibition ended and marijuana were taxed and regulated, they estimate the combined savings and revenues could be somewhere between $14 and $40 billion a year. In 2008, the U.S. spent more than $13 million on marijuana eradications, seizing some 4.6 million plants on public lands alone. Aside from the public safety hazard, they say illegal marijuana grows endanger wildlife and the environment. Among the fertilizer and food, the areas are littered with animal remains.
We found this in the cultivation site. It's a front left bear paw. It's been cut at the wrist, and then one of the digits has been cut off.
The government doesn't have enough resources to clean up the mess.
Stay back around the perimeter.
So they rely on volunteer groups like the High Sierra Trail Crew. Months after this 12,000 plant grow was found in Sequoia National Forest, the crew flies back to haul out the trash. The mess is practically untouched.
Here's what's left of some form of a rifle.
The team discovers multiple propane tanks.
These are a major hazard. If a fire was to start in this area, an unsuspecting fire crew that might march into here could walk into the path of something that would either explode or potentially shoot flame 15 or 20 feet away.
They find pesticides and chemicals, some that have been outlawed in the United States.
We don't know what are the long-term effects of these chemicals being washed into our water system. So these go into the creeks that feed the streams, that feed the lakes that we recreate in. A lot of people, hunters, fisher, campermen, are ingesting these pesticides.
Brogan and his team average 12 to 15 marijuana grow sites a year and have just been handed 160 more.
For every site that they find, there's 4 that they don't find. There's probably another 500 out here that nobody even knows about.
For him, marijuana is not a political issue. It's a personal one.
I grew up in the mountains. I love the mountains. And to see this, it really repulses me.
13 states have passed laws decriminalizing marijuana for medical use. But no state is like California, the only one with more than 300 dispensaries, places where people with doctors' recommendations can openly go to buy it. But while organizations like the American College of Physicians are calling for further research into numerous potential medical uses for marijuana, the Food and Drug Administration says it has no accepted medical value. And in the eyes of the federal government, it remains illegal in any form. So how does this all play out in California, long considered ground zero of the medical marijuana movement?
This is the future.
At the pharmacy, a dispensary in Westwood, California, General Manager Bill Leahy says the doors are open.
We don't feel that we have anything to hide or anything to be embarrassed about.
Here, with a doctor's recommendation, you can buy medical marijuana or cannabis in just about any form you like. In gelato, in chocolate bars, in cold drinks, even lollipops.
There are 3 X's on this particular chocolate cake. That means there are 3 dosages of medicine in here.
Now, what would happen if somebody ate this whole, piece of cake? It's got 5 doses of cannabis in it, if they were eat it all at once.
If they ate it all at once, they would be over-medicating. okay? There have been 0 deaths caused by cannabis. You cannot overdose. You may, sleep pretty well that night.
Yeah.
Leahy says that the pharmacy doesn't make a profit and that it abides by strict state laws, buying from designated growers and selling only to those with a doctor's recommendation.
There's a lot of documentation.
Oh, yeah. Everything has to be completely documented. If there is no documentation or anything is out of line, or if they don't have a California ID that's current, I don't even care if they have it. If it's not current, we don't let them in.
So what's the difference between the stuff you buy on the street and the marijuana or cannabis you buy in here?
Everything we have here is organic. All of our caregivers that supply the cannabis for us have not added any pesticides or added anything to it to change the value of the medicine. What you buy in the street is hit or miss.
You take what you get.
You take what you get.
At a dispensary, customers can pick and choose from a wide variety of high-grade marijuana.
They have the opportunity to open it up and get a sense of the aroma.
Yeah. That almost smells like almost like a tea.
According to Americans for Safe Access, there are more than 200,000 people in California with a doctor's recommendation for marijuana.
Every doctor I talked to that I asked about it, any complications in it, they said that's the best thing to do.
In a 2005 interview with Dateline's Stone Phillips, Melissa Etheridge, a breast cancer survivor, talks candidly about using medical marijuana every day during her chemotherapy.
There's the drug that you take for the pain, but that constipates you, so you have to take the constipation drug, but then that actually gives you diarrhea, so you need a little diarrhea drug. Instead of taking 5 or 6 of the prescriptions, I decided to go a natural route and smoke marijuana. I was doing a lot of it at the time for my pain and for my symptoms, and the minute I didn't feel it, I stopped.
Do you worry at all that talking about this from a medicinal standpoint might encourage recreational use?
Do I worry that that will be abused? Yeah, I mean, Vicodin's abused. Everything that brings pain relief is abused. But does that mean because Vicodin is abused, do they keep it away from people? No, they prescribe it. Put the laws on it, prescribe it.
It's an argument that's gaining ground across the country. But in a place like California, where dispensaries advertise in magazines, access to marijuana is easier than ever.
Medical marijuana recommendations to have this as opposed to pharmaceuticals, and that's what Dr. Johnson wants to make sure everyone has access to if they need it.
It's a whole new industry that caters to the very sick and people looking to get high legally.
There's a lot of recreational users who have a license that they got from a doctor, because these doctors that give medical marijuana evaluations, they call it, I don't know if they're turning anybody away. And now I have a license that says I can smoke pot. No one here has that. Not in Idaho. But you should.
Comedian and marijuana user Doug Benson stars in Super Jaime, a movie that chronicles his pot smoking for 30 straight days.
I agree that if you feel like it helps you in your life and makes you feel better, whether it's anxiety or depression or, you just like it, I don't see why you shouldn't have access to it.
When it came to defining who should have access to it, Proposition 215, the 1996 ballot initiative that decriminalized medical marijuana in California, purposely left things vague.
It listed approximately 10 conditions, but then it said, or any condition agreed upon by the physician and the patient, where cannabis could be helpful. So that pretty much leaves it between the doctor and the patient, which is where it belongs.
Dr. Alan Frankel practiced internal medicine for 26 years before dedicating 80% of his practice to medical marijuana. In over 2 years, he says, he saw 3,400 patients. The average age, close to 50.
Some of these patients are, CEO, there's not one demographic. I mean, we have all the data. It's from everywhere, every income group, every education level.
They come to him with a wide range of ailments, from cancer and HIV to chronic pain, insomnia, and anxiety.
They come in and sometimes they just can't believe this is really happening and that it's legal, it works. Patients aren't coming in, oh, I'm a little better. I appreciate it. It's like, this has changed my life.
What most people never realized, he says, is that there are two different strains of medical marijuana, sativa and indica, that work to treat different conditions.
So now with the dispensing system, we're able to get sativas and indicas. We're able to tell people which ones to use at which time.
While Frankel acknowledges there are legal substitutes that do similar things, he says many people prefer pot's predictable side effects to prescription medications.
I think most people agree that, if nothing else, cannabis is extremely safe. So if somebody comes in with some insomnia to try using cannabis before they go get sleeping pills, I think is completely reasonable.
Frankel says patients don't necessarily need to smoke marijuana. In fact, it's better if they don't.
It's clearly not the ultimate way to use it.
He recommends tinctures that were once available back in the 1800s over the counter.
You'd spray it into your mouth, a few spritzes, and the effect is about 2 hours.
There are also strips to put under your tongue and capsules as well. Frankel believes this centuries-old medicine will one day become accepted treatment in the future, not only because of its wide-ranging benefits, but also because it keeps health care costs low. But the government view couldn't be more different. They say marijuana is harmful, and the dispensaries that sell it open up a can of worms for law enforcement.
We have seen so many abuses from dispensaries issuing flyers at high schools, handing out free samples to kids to come and try their products. But these dispensaries are definitely not just dispensing marijuana under medical means.
There are people who have abused the system, whether they're pharmacy operators or patients.
Correct.
Do you want those people run out?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is serious business. This is medicine. This is not a game.
Leahy says the pharmacy sells in limited quantities to prevent resale on the streets. And one other thing, dispensaries in California pay taxes. While no exact data exists, last year the State Board of Equalization says dispensaries generated at least $11.4 million in sales tax. The board acknowledges the actual number is probably much higher. But despite many dispensaries complying with state guidelines, buying, selling, cultivating, or being in possession of marijuana for any reason is still a federal crime.
People need to realize that there's no legal means for anyone to obtain marijuana.
The DEA says it doesn't go after patients or doctors, but they do target dispensaries, which they say can be a magnet for crime and illegal drug traffickers.
We need to look at who's supplying these individuals. Where's the marijuana coming from? We're looking at dispensaries who are making huge amounts of money that may be being laundered through different means. And so we look at all those different aspects and determine who's the most egregious of those, and we try to target those individuals first.
How'd you get the real criminal? Get the heroin dealer, my boy.
But protesters believe the DEA goes after dispensaries who make the most noise.
They take the money, they take the medicine, and they don't actually arrest anybody. So essentially this is harassment.
The U.S. Supreme Court says when the two laws conflict, federal law trumps state law. And the DEA says they'll continue to uphold federal law.
We definitely believe we're having an impact, but because there are so many here in Los Angeles, it is a difficult task.
For Bill Leahy, whose West Hollywood store was raided in 2007, trying to operate a legitimate business in such murky territory is difficult, but worth the risk.
Are you worried each day about the DEA coming in to shut you down?
Every day that we open those doors, we practice civil disobedience. Every day. Does it worry me? Sure.
Save access now! Save access now!
Protesting, brother. Shut our place down.
July 25th, 2007. The DEA raids 10 medical marijuana dispensaries throughout Los Angeles.
We're patients, not criminals!
Why did they do this to our club? They bust the vending machines? Oh, man.
Save access now!
The same day, city leaders call for an end to the DEA's crackdown.
Our council people, our government, our state and city officials are voting to support medical marijuana patients, and it's really, really important that the DEA not go against the will of the people that voted this in.
Prior to the raids, the DEA sends letters to more than 100 landlords of dispensary tenants warning them that they risk property seizure and possible imprisonment.
Our local government condemned the DEA's action for threatening landlords of medical cannabis dispensaries today, and also said that they do not want the LAPD cooperating with the DEA, that the LAPD has more other crime that they need to be looking after, and that medical cannabis is not a crime.
It's a messy situation that continually plays out across California.
Yeah, but they're arresting people on the other side now.
Arresting protesters?
Yeah, it's crazy because it's legal to open up a dispensary. Local law enforcement doesn't, get involved.
We know nothing about the operation inside. We're just here for crowd control.
But the feds come in and bust the places. So it is the Wild West right now here in California.
To add to the confusion, it's not only the federal law that conflicts with state law. In California, local laws and tolerance for dispensaries vary from county to county and city to city. In 2007, the controversy arrived in full force in the town of Morro Bay, California. A year earlier, Charles Lynch, a former software engineer, had opened a dispensary called Central Coast Compassionate Caregivers, the only medical marijuana facility within 100 miles. For years, Charles says he suffered from debilitating migraine headaches and drove long distances for the drug.
I decided that we kind of needed one in our local area, not just for me, but for our patients, or the patients in our area.
Charles's dispensary had the approval of the local city council and the town mayor, Janice Peters.
It was very discreet. Anyone passing by would hardly know it was there.
Lynch was asked to join the Chamber of Commerce, and for a time, business ran smoothly.
So you felt you were doing everything by the book according to state law?
Oh, yes, I felt definitely so.
Mayor Peters agreed that Lynch ran a tight ship, and she never had a problem.
I personally went around to every single business around the dispensary, gave them my card, said, call the police too, but please call me if anything concerns you or upsets you about this business. And I never had a single call in the almost year that they were there.
But the local sheriff investigated the dispensary and says some community members did have concerns.
They didn't like the fact that there were people who, from all appearances, did not give any signs of having any serious illnesses, so they felt that there was an outward abuse of what the law intended.
But one of Charles's patients, Owen Beck, was 17 when he came to Charles's dispensary with his dad.
I'd vomited literally 4 times a day.
Owen Beck was diagnosed with bone cancer his senior year of high school and began 6 rounds of rigorous chemotherapy.
It's just terrible, just disgusting feeling all the time. They tried to give me medication for it, painkillers and all kinds of stuff, but nothing really worked.
Owen says he couldn't keep the pills down. His doctor recommended medical marijuana, and Owen talked about it with his dad.
He was very open to it. He just put all political views aside and was just, this is my son, he needs to get better, so I think we should try anything that's going to work.
Owen says he'd smoke 4 times a day and noticed the change immediately.
It was the only thing that alleviated any of my symptoms. The nausea would go away. I'd be able to eat a small meal, get some nutrition for the day. It would relax me, basically.
A short time later, Owen says medical marijuana became even more of a necessity when he had to have his leg amputated.
The phantom pain's actually the worst. It basically feels like nails are just being nailed into your entire leg. It's like the worst experience I've ever had in my life. But the marijuana did numb the pain a lot.
But back in Morro Bay, medical marijuana would soon become temporarily unavailable. Early one morning in 2007, Charles called up his secretary at the dispensary to tell her he was running late.
She was frantic. She was telling me, Charlie, they're here. And I says, what?
Authorities arrested one of Charles's employees for selling marijuana to undercover police agents miles from the dispensary, something Charles says he knew nothing about. Seconds later, Charles heard banging at his front door.
And they says, search warrant, open up, search warrant. And my heart just dropped and started pounding. And they says, open the door, we're gonna bang it down, you know? And so I opened the door, and about 15 guys with machine guns, bulletproof vests, came barreling in through my door, and they put me on the ground there with a gun to my head.
So the DEA was banging on your door at the same time they were raiding your dispensary?
Right, it was a simultaneous raid.
Deputies carried boxes of evidence out of the dispensary around 2:30 this afternoon. The DEA would not comment on what was inside them.
Back at Charles's house, he was handed a search warrant.
Well, actually, after I read the search warrant, I kind of felt like they were hoping to find a big, huge grow operation in my house. So I found a little bit of relief there.
The DEA walked away with Charles's computer, his personal medical marijuana supply, and $27,000 he had in the house. But Charles wasn't arrested, and like many other dispensaries who were raided before, he reopened a short time later.
In hindsight, do you think maybe it would have been better if you just shut down?
Well, actually, I felt like I had a lot of people depending on me. There was definitely a big question in my mind whether I should reopen, and I went to the city attorney of Morro Bay. He had told me that that it was okay for me to reopen.
The reopening was short-lived. Charles says the DEA called his landlord and told him he risked having his property seized, and so Charles was forced to close his dispensary for good.
You figured that's it, you're done.
Right, and the dispensary was closed. I was, looking for a new job, a new project.
But just as Charles was looking for a fresh start, the DEA and local sheriff came knocking again.
They told me to step outside, told me I was under arrest for, distribution of marijuana on the federal level.
Try and relax. I know you're a little nervous right now, but it's going to be okay. Okay.
Charles was charged with cultivating and conspiracy to distribute marijuana, operating a drug premises, and selling to minors. His family put up $400,000 in bail while he awaited trial in an ankle bracelet for the next 9 months.
So the charges against you, the government brings pretty serious. They said you sold marijuana to 250 minors, that you made $2.1 million in less than a year.
Actually, can I address those one at a time as you go? My rules from the city were, 18 or older unless accompanied by a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but under federal law, I found out that anybody under 21 is considered a minor. And so they used that law, they used that against me to make it sound like I was down on the streets in front of the schoolyard selling marijuana to minors.
As for the $2.1 million, Charles doesn't deny that might have been his gross proceeds from the business, but he says he never profited from his dispensary, which would have been a violation of state law. He says the $2.1 million number didn't account for any of his expenses, like paying for the marijuana, payroll, and rent. But the number of customers, particularly young people, buying marijuana didn't sit right with the local sheriff.
San Luis Obispo County has a population of about 63,000 people. We had over 2,000 individuals that were going to this facility under the auspices of needing medicinal marijuana. We had over 270 minors, individuals under the age of 21. Those large numbers, based on our population, just seemed to be out of whack.
At Charles's trial, Owen Beck, now in remission, was a character witness, but his testimony was cut short when he mentioned medical marijuana. The judge had ruled such evidence irrelevant under federal law.
They didn't allow us to talk about the California state laws that allowed me to do this. They didn't allow us to talk about my business license or the 18 or older stuff. They didn't let us talk about a lot of things.
So do you feel like you got a fair trial?
Well, I don't think there was anything fair about federal court.
After a 2-week trial, the jury reached a verdict.
I just couldn't believe it.
Charles Lynch was found guilty on all counts.
The majority of us felt like he was a nice man with good intentions who didn't stay within the parameters of the federal law.
Charles faced 5 to 85 years in prison.
They could take me away in cuffs right then and there. My car will be sitting in the parking lot. My house will be, the way I left it. I'll lose everything if they take me to jail that day.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, man. It's my honor.
It's the fall of 2008.
Free Charlie Lynch!
And Charles Lynch is weeks away from sentencing for selling marijuana at his dispensary in Morro Bay, California.
Thank you for standing up for us.
Right on, thanks, man. Thank you.
Here at a medical marijuana expo, he's among supporters.
I wish you well. You know
all right,
that,
thank you. Appreciate
I wish
it.
you well.
And in front of the federal courthouse,
if they can take Charles Lynch, they can take anyone standing in this crowd. So we have to take a stand, and we need Charles to have another day in court, a fair day in court. We need a new trial for Charles Lynch. Woo!
You know, I've never been an activist or nothing like that.
It waged a civil war against us, the people.
But it is great to see people making signs and chanting, you know. And that was definitely a great day for me.
but Charles says the last few months have taken their toll.
I'm about to lose my house. It's been difficult finding work. My financial situation is beyond bankruptcy.
As Charles nervously awaits his fate, he sees one glimmer of hope, a change of